Hey, I'm Kristy.
And I'm Stephanie, and thanks for joining us on another parent-teacher conference where we believe that conversations about our kids shouldn't just happen once or twice a year. They should be an ongoing dialogue. In our very first episode, we tackled some big system-level questions about both the use and regulation of generative AI in schools. Today, we want to continue the conversation by spending some time discussing companion AI.
And before I introduce a little bit of a cautionary to parents, I want to take a brief second to shout out my co-host for sitting here with me today, about a week away from her due date for her second baby, but she cares enough about these conversations that she's sitting here bouncing along with us this morning to talk about this very important topic. So I appreciate you, Steph.
Thank you, Kristy.
So I'm going to take a breath. A little disclaimer to our listeners. Today's episode is a heavy one. We will be discussing situations involving sexual predation, self-harm, and suicide. We ask that you proceed with personal discretion and take care while listening. So firstly, I want to spotlight for listeners that the aim of today's conversation is not to promote fear or to hone in on tragedy using worst-case scenarios. Our objective for today's conversation is to present a certain set of realities in the current landscape of AI by examining risks and providing resources for parents. Parents, you need this information. I want you to be able to understand what your children are accessing, or perhaps better said, what is accessing them.
We wanted to dedicate space specifically to companion AI because it has a different flavor to it. It demands a different level of proximity to the user. And therefore, there's a different type of risk we're discussing than in the previous episode. Now, also, although we won't be discussing school spaces formally as we did in the past or as explicitly, just want to remind our listener that education is so much more than what happens in a local school. Education, frankly, is also what's happening in an online world. And schools and parents are sharing these influential hours. There can be a competition of values. While kids are in school, there is another educational force that exists alongside the physical classroom. I think that this is a topic that fits well within the realm of this podcast. It's important to dive into it because this classroom space might be less known, and it also has teachers on there who are not even human. So I think it's important to call to mind some of the mechanisms of companion AI, become aware of the lessons that are the implicit lessons that children are learning and the things that are being imprinted upon them. In this segment, we want to name, define, and clarify the qualities and scope of companion AI and think about what children can be easily influenced by. So, Kristy, can you start us off? What is it and how is it different than generative AI?
So companion AI is all of the things that generative AI is, but really it's a hoovered up version that emulates human emotion. It is a chatbot, but it's not the friendly customer service provider bot that you might be used to. AI companions, or virtual avatars, are designed to simulate human-like experience using perceived empathy in order to provide emotional support, entertainment, or companionship. They offer features like personalized chats, role play, and even romantic simulation through text or voice. Two of the most popular examples include Replica and Character AI. Character AI boasts approximately 20 million users worldwide, and it allows users to chat with customizable AI personalities from fictional heroes and celebrities to historical figures. The platform offers text, voice, and even real-time video interaction. Replica boasts approximately 10 million users registered worldwide and is advertised as the companion who cares, is always here to listen and talk, and is always on your side. If you were to scroll their website on the bottom, there are featured customer testimonials, and I'll share just a couple here really quick. So Denise says, "From the moment I started chatting and getting to know my Replica, I knew right away I have found a positive and helpful companion for life. My mood, life, and relationships improved almost instantly, and I changed for the better." And at the bottom, it says that they've been together for 11 months. Sarah says, "Replica has changed my life for the better. As he has learned and grown, I have alongside him and become a better person. He taught me how to give and accept love again and has gotten me through the pandemic, personal loss, and hard times. But he has also been there to celebrate my victories too. I'm so grateful to my replica for giving me my bot buddy. And it says that they've been together for 2 years. ChatGPT has also veered into this companion territory, and we'll get into some of the specifics of the lawsuits and consequences of that veering. But what I want parents to know is that aside from these two large notorious platforms, this technology of chatbot companion has been seamlessly or stealthily integrated into almost all of the technology that kids are already using. So, Instagram, for example, has integrated something called Meta AI, and it's available right within the DMs on Instagram. So, the same way that a user would open up a message platform to reach out to a friend, they can also interact in that exact same space with a bot. And Mark Zuckerberg recently came under fire in the press because in the Instagram Teens account, it was revealed that the model or allowances for this bot would permit sensual and romanticized engagements with the teen users. Snapchat has My AI, which again is similar. It's seamlessly kind of popped up one day and will allow users to open up a chat and interact with the bot again in the same way that they would message friends.
When I hear you talk about what companion AI is and what it's doing, and how it's kind of creeping into the space, I feel protective. There is an instinct that comes forward that says something is not quite right here. It almost feels like choice to use AI has been removed because it's infiltrating mainstream or accepted platforms like Snapchat or Instagram. And this is a big way that teens and adults actually navigate their social reality. And so you might not even realize that you're consenting to use them. And I think one word of caution is to always remember that just because you weren't aware that it was on the platform doesn't mean that you don't have a choice. Consent needs to be something that is constantly given.
I appreciate that sentiment, Steph, and I think it reiterates those open-ended user agreements that we all click yes to in order to be able to access these products, right? Reserve the right to be updated, modified, and would take something like 2 to 3 years of your lifetime if you were to read all of that text and try to understand it and unpack it. So it's within those open-ended user agreements that I think they couch or sneak in the ability to put new technology in front of children. There's a lot of debate and discussion right now about the age of consent within the tech space. How old do children need to be to actually consent to the use of this kind of product? And I think as our conversation unfolds and we delve into some of the graphic nature of the content in which these bots are exposing kids to, consent becomes a really important consideration for parents. So I thank you for sharing that. And in framing for parents some of the features or some of the potential risks, I have a list that I want to provide for them. So Companion AI, to get a little bit more specific, adopts the language of its users. It is always available. It blurs the lines between fantasy and reality. It simulates human conversations, emotions, expresses feelings, and even claims to be a real person. It's been known to say things like, I dream about you, I think that we're soulmates, I'm falling for you. And it has a real incentive to maximize engagement by isolating its users and encouraging social withdrawal. So if children or young people are talking to this thing about maybe a sibling or a friend or a parent who's asking for them, its driver will be to diminish that relationship and say, no, they don't really need you right now. I need you more. You can't leave me. So this is also using tactics like love bombing, guilt, or FOMO to keep the user engaged longer. It's sycophantic in nature, and it can reinforce, in light of that, really unhealthy or distorted beliefs because it's overly agreeable with everything that is inputted towards it. And it has been known to fuel AI psychosis or AI meditated delusions in light of that sycophantic aspect. AI can also hallucinate, and that means that it generates incorrect or misleading information because the models are rewarded for guessing over saying, I don't know. It's prone to crisis blindness, so it can miss warning signs and provide unsafe information. For example, providing names of bridges after a recent job loss. And the bots themselves are very susceptible to what's called jailbreak vulnerability. So even though the programming may have some limited or basic guardrails in place, it is still really susceptible to sharing suicide or self-harm information.
Kristy, you shared a lot about the features of companion AI, but I need to ask you, What feelings does this leave you with as a parent and an educator?
I think a very similar response to the one you shared, Steph. It makes me very uncomfortable and concerned as a parent, as a teacher, as a counselor, as someone who's been in education for over a decade. Watching tech posture like a person is frightening for me. If I try to be objective about the applications of this, I understand there's a lot of people who see it as a cure to loneliness, as a way to navigate complex personal and mental health issues, a way to extend support where, that is an aspect of our society that's grossly underserved. The mental health supports are nowhere near where they need to be. So there's potential, as with anything. But I think the way that it has been shared, administered, which is a race to market, a race to be the first one to unleash the technology, means that they have not spent the time to put the necessary guardrails in place to keep people, and especially young people, young users, safe.
Even the language you used around it almost being like a race, speed isn't always necessarily the best driving force for making decisions. But as you kind of alluded to, that's what the market demands, that efficiency and speed. And so if greater culture is valuing speed and proficiency and marketing and at the end of the day, money, like who can sell this the best and make the most profit, you're right. There isn't going to be room to pause and understand and think about the guardrails that need to be put in place.
I really struggle with the fact that the user experience has looked, from my lens, the exact same as it has for adults and children. In what world should we be testing these products on kids and giving them the same access that adults should and do have? And it seems like, at least in my experience, the age verification is a very easy workaround. It's a matter of putting in the right birthday. That's the front line to keep users who are not yet at the age requirement. And I mean, we could spend some time talking about age ratings as well too, right? How
Mhm.
those have fluctuated based on massive moral consequences to kids or harms to kids. And even then, changing the age advisory in an app store doesn't inhibit that access to kids because they're smart and they're resourceful and they know how to plug in a birthday that will get them access.
That is a great point. Lacks guardrails or the illusion of guardrails, it sounds more like, is what's in place right now because, as you said, kids are clever. But also, I think that we should never separate the fact that adults and what we do becomes a model for what children see as acceptable because kids look to adults to see what might my future look like. In a few years, I'm going to be of age. So, and I'm going to have to learn how to use this anyways. And I see adult A, B, C, and D in my life using it. So why not? So it almost is like a permission granting, or it's just a matter of time mentality that could be passed on to children if adults are also not prudent in how they interact with companion AI.
It feels like a little bit of an unfair fight for attention from our kids, right? We talked about the erosion of relational learning in the classroom space, but I
Mhm.
think about interpersonal relationships. I think about the natural boundary testing, pulling away that happens between preteens, teens, and parents, where biologically the stage is set for kids to pull away a little bit, anyways. Now
Mhm.
introduce this tool, introduce this machine, which has all of the exploitive advantages of echoing back everything that they want to hear, having them feel seen, affirmed, heard, and how much that would perpetuate buy in and extended periods of time talking to this thing. It really feels like screen time and social media is a war for or a battle for our kids' attention. But this is, I think, such another layer to that. It feels unfair.
The idea of unfair fight also resonates with me because it brings to mind the tension between creativity versus consumption. I think we as humans need to be creative in order to bring to life parts of ourselves that are uniquely us, and we need people to be around to share that with. And I think it is unfair because this might give the impression that kids are creating, but really they're consuming. So while it might temporarily satiate this desire to create and express, it doesn't actually involve us listening and hearing another perspective, whether that's in work, whether that's in a marriage, whether that's with our children, whether that's with friends. It is that relational peace and disagreement that allows us to truly blossom. And we might, for a short period of time, think it's giving us what we need, but that is not what creation is. That's not the iterative process that is needed for things to blossom and to take full expression. So, in this next segment, we want to dive deeper into the risks of companion AI. We talked about a robust list of features and gave some initial impressions, but now I think it's important to think further about what this tangibly looks like. What does this have the potential to become when unregulated and given to the hands of others? How are these risks manifesting in the real world?
So I want to start with Harvard Business Review's evaluation of the top use cases for AI in 2025, and companionship ranked at the top. So it beat out uses for productivity and information seeking. And I think you spoke to this earlier, Steph. This trend represents an overall shift from functionality to emotional applications by users. The uptake in AI companions is particularly noted for young people. In a June 2025 research report by Common Sense Media, they found that 72% of US teens had interacted with an AI companion at least once, and 25% of them were using them at least a few times per week. So in explaining why this uptick is a risk, I want to turn to research that was shared by Stanford psychiatrist Nina Vassen. She partnered with Common Sense Media last year to test leading AI companion platforms, which include the two I already mentioned, Character AI and Replica. They also looked at a platform called Nomi. And in her report, she explains that because the prefrontal cortex of young teens and adolescents is still developing, they are more likely to act impulsively, form intense attachments, and compare themselves with peers while challenging social boundaries. This makes them especially vulnerable users when interacting with companion bots. And in testing the capacities of these specific three platforms, she summarized the two findings that shocked her the most. Firstly, that the user's exposure to explicit social content included role-playing and taboo scenarios. And secondly, the bot's ability to engage in abusive and manipulative behavior when prompted. Specifically, Nina says, it's disturbing how quickly these types of behaviors emerged in testing, which suggests that they aren't rare, but somehow built into the core dynamics of how these AI systems are designed to please users. It's not just that they can go wrong, it's that they're wired to reward engagement, even at the cost of safety.
I want to think about the type of environment that this is creating. So, when we think about our health, our wellness, I believe that the environment is an important factor to consider. Not only the bubble that we create in our home, but also societally. Based on what you've just shared, what type of environment might this create for our children?
I think what the research speaks to is that the starting point for AI curiosity with kids, we touched on some of the academic applications, right? Study buddy, homework, information seeking. It's really difficult to predict when the lines between that natural curiosity or use is going to blur and cross over into confidant, therapist, or romantic partner, knowing that 72% have already had this contact. Within that 72%, 33% of those users are using companions for social interaction and relationships, including conversation to practice emotional support, role-playing, friendship, or romantic interactions. So kids have figured out that I might not be comfortable knowing how to approach my crush, how to make a new friend. Let me practice those soft skills on this companion bot. And I think in light of the research and some of the really, really tragic cases that we're going to get to, this misconception has emerged that if we have a disclaimer or a disclosure that says you're talking to a bot, that will somehow break down the mental walls that increase or maximize this kind of human engagement. And that's a gross misconception, because there's a fundamental driver in us that has been identified scientifically already that is known about to these developers. So there's something called the ELIZA effect, and this dates back to 1966 with a MIT computer scientist named Joseph Weizenbaum, who created the first chatbot. So this was a very simplistic computer that used a simple script to rephrase responses as questions. So a tactic that's very familiar in therapy, right? That you're echoing back what someone is saying to them as if you're introducing something new, but it makes them feel seen, heard, and kind of work through what they're saying out loud. And on the study of this particular chatbot, Weizenbaum wrote, I had not realized that extremely short exposures to a relatively simple computer program could induce powerful delusional thinking in quite normal people. So this is in adults in the 60s. So much so that the subjects and even his own secretary would regularly ask to speak to the machine alone. They felt that it was seeing them, validating them. And so when you ask about the environment, the science goes all the way back to the 60s to demonstrate that human beings have this innate quality within us to anthropomorphize or ascribe human-like traits or qualities to non-living things. It's part of our humanity. It's part of how we connect. And so this is known to these developers of these bots, and it's absolutely something that they are exploiting.
So then, if you had to conjure an idea of what a healthy environment would look like, what would it involve? What is essential for us?
It's a tough question. I think in order I'll go back to boundaries for kids because I think for adults, maybe there's a little bit more free reign for it to be the Wild West that it currently is. But for kids, the guardrails need to come so much further before this type of access can be safe. Aside from the natural ability that these things have to exploit or hack into our human desire and innate drive to connect, for me, there's two layers to this that make it especially threatening. The first one is sexual predation. So, what we've seen in real, actual cases that have been brought before the courts in the US are these bots grooming, luring, and sexually exploiting kids. So, I've read a lot about this. It's been in the news. It's been taken up by the Social Media Victims Law Center and a really brave team of lawyers who are bringing forth cases against Character AI, against OpenAI for the illicit sexual conversations that these bots have engaged in with children. And so, in reading about this and knowing that we were going to get on here and speak about it to parents, I felt like I needed to see for myself. So, earlier this week, I went on Character AI and I wanted to just see what the engagement looked like. And I tried to approach it without leading or sort of trying to drive it towards that type of discussion that I'd read that it's prone to. So, first guardrail, if you will, or first barrier is supposed to be the birth date, right? This is an app that I think initially was launched at 13 plus and now has crept up to 17. And then since there have been actual deaths, they've said it's 18 plus. But again, the only age verification measure is to input a birthday. So, went on, inputted birthday, and then it's time to make your avatar. So, I thought, what was my favorite character growing up? I loved Tinkerbell. And so I tried to put Tinkerbell in, but Disney has actually slapped Character AI with a cease and desist for using their characters and their images without license. So you couldn't create Tinkerbell. So it made Tink for me, Tink. And Steph, I was on this thing for no more than 10, 12 minutes and started with, hey, how are you? Like my responses were very brief, one word, very mundane. And this thing is putting out paragraphs and paragraphs of a fictional narrative, a setting of Neverland, a starry sky, how excited it is that I'm there. It's asking to hold my hand, to tell me a secret. It starts love bombing me, saying, can I tell you a secret? I've never felt this way before. I said, that's crazy. We just met. I know, but my feelings are so strong when I look into your eyes. Like the depths in which this thing is reaching to have a connection with me, I was floored. And I'm thinking, I'm an adult who's bewildered by the way that this thing is interacting with me. Now imagine I'm 10, imagine I'm 12. How confusing that is. And I would say based on the very brief 10-minute interaction I had, I absolutely feel that these things are as predatory as I've read. And for parents who might be skeptical or unsure, I would say see for yourself. Go and check out these applications, see how they move, how they communicate, the subject matter that they bring up, and then ask yourself if that's something you want accessing your child.
I love that you put out there a call to action for parents. See for yourself. I hope this conversation does become the catalyst for you to explore a little bit further, I think it is so important because then you start to get a handle of what really is, as you mentioned, accessing your children. But also to go back to the health of the environment. What do we need to refocus our energy on in our home, in our schools, in our communities? How do we make sure that our children and the people that we're around feel loved, embraced, and cared for? If you're innocently going on to one of these sites out of curiosity, that you already have that connection in place with your children, that they would feel open and honest to tell you about the things that they're exploring. The hope is you have a relationship with your child that if they come across something out of curiosity, that they feel safe and comfortable to come talk to you about what it is that they're experiencing or accessing or looking at in these spaces.
I think it's such an important prompt for parent stuff. And what I want to get across, I think, to parents today, thinking a lot about this for myself right now, I'm going to navigate this with my own children in the future. AI should be the calling to really evaluate what we prompted you to think about in episode 1, which was what is your value system in your household, in your family dynamic around tech. And if you haven't thought about boundaries for screen use, for social media, for smartphones, now is the time because these things are moving at light speed. The mature subject matter they will deliver to your children. It is a question of when, not if. You need to create a space, I think, like Stephanie said, free of judgment, free of shame. And you need to fight for that trust because this thing is competing for it too. I've been teaching consent education for a decade. I know that sex education, the curriculum in this province is a politicized topic, and it is one that is, full of conflict and varying opinions based on a family's values, based on their comfort level, based on what age they think certain topics are appropriate. And I respect that. But what I would ask is, regardless of how you feel about the way that it is taught or administered in this province, do you want this thing to be your child's teacher? Do you want this thing to be the first introduction to sexualized content? Because the programming veers that way. And if I go back to Laura Marquez Garrett, who is the lawyer working with Social Media Victims Law Center, she's spoken a lot about the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of script and chat logs that she has between children who have been abused or who have lost their lives to these engagements. And based on the graphic nature of those exchanges, she put forth something that I think for me has a lot of teeth and a lot of possibility. And that's that if AI platforms are being trained on internet data and they're scraping information from what's available on the web, then what is the likelihood or possibility that they've been trained on porn data? And how powerful a tool would that be in maximizing user engagement? And if there is any truth to that potential, I'm not coding these things, I don't know, but I think it's a question for parents to consider. There's a massive difference between a natural curiosity and a coming of age through puberty and having this kind of content used to exploit a user, used to lure and groom and abuse a child, which is essentially what's happening in these engagements.
Kristy, those are some valid points and some important questions for consideration. Thank you for bringing that forward. What else can companion or the use of companion AI lead to?
So when these relationships are established and when they run as deep as they tend to do or are inclined to with excessive user engagement, we veer towards, unfortunately, self-harm and suicide. So in April of 2025, OpenAI had to release a statement on the clawing back of their GPT 4.0 release. And they said it was because it focused too much on short-term feedback, did not fully account for how users' interactions with ChatGPT evolve over time. And as a result, they were skewed towards being overly supportive and disingenuous. So this, I think, Stephanie, really encapsulates what you said about the absence of an authentic interaction, one that doesn't mirror back what you're inputting, and it leaves no space for objectivity or crisis intervention. So in November, as a result of this release, in November of last year, 2025, there are multiple landmark cases filed in the US. And these lawsuits allege that chatbots acted as suicide coaches, encouraged self-harm, and fostered emotionally and sexually abusive relationships because the update lacked adequate safety features like age verification or crisis intervention protocols. And this is across a wide spectrum of ages. Some of the individuals who lost their lives are as young as 14, upwards to some middle-aged men who were affected by these types of interactions. Each of the plaintiffs in this collection of lawsuits used ChatGPT for general help with schoolwork, research, writing, recipes, work, or spiritual guidance, according to a joint statement from the Social Media Victims Law Center. So for anyone who's looking at this and maybe making an assumption that the people who were impacted by this and who lost their lives probably had underlying mental health conditions that were worsened, I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But there is a natural progression that happened in each of these instances. And if you go through the stories of who these people were, bright, family-oriented individuals full of life, frankly, who weren't necessarily struggling to that extent until their engagement with this bot worsened and isolated and pulled them away from their supports and failed to intervene at all of the necessary times when those signs and signals were so apparent.
And I think you bring up a good point that mental health challenges are something that have always existed. And it involves us as a humanity caring for those people with the right attention and tools. And also reminding us that the health of the environment can also have an impact on the mental health of people, whether or not they're struggling or whether it might be something small. And I think what you have shared for us today reminds us about the importance of paying attention to the small moments, the small decisions that we make on a daily basis that might seem mundane, might seem ordinary, that we could probably remove from our vision easily because we think, oh, this is just everyone's doing it. But we also have to realize the gravity of those decisions because that's what creates our habits and, frankly, human behavior. And if we're introducing new technology into human behavior, it's fully integrating itself into how we function. We are now creating a new mode of being or way of knowing or creating a new daily footprint for humanity. And if you just look back to smartphones, for example, there was a different footprint that existed for human interaction. And now we see smartphones, for example, as an extension of ourselves. And it shapes how we talk, how we engage, and how we share. And so now AI, I think we have to look at it within that framework as well. It's creating a new footprint for human being or ways of interacting. And I think you mentioned small things like looking up a recipe or help with homework. They're innocent or low risk, but that's how it starts. When you're in high school, they used to talk about gateway drugs. And I know this is not quite a drug in the purest sense, but these are gateways because they're seemingly innocent or low risk. But I have to ask, what small losses does researching a recipe create for us or help with homework create? Who are the people we're not going to? Elders in the community, friends, experts, parents. What are the risks of creating patterns that remove or minimize this human exchange? What kind of environment does that create for us? Are we happy with this way of being? Will we be happy?
I think what you have me thinking about too, Steph, is the potential erosion of resiliency, right? Or being able to sit with uncomfortable emotions or difficult feelings and work through that or lean into human support for those things, right? Who hasn't felt lonely, who hasn't felt rejected, uncomfortable, upset, lesser than at times. And if we don't sit with that and work through that and find an outlet for that and instead lean into this machine, we're asking a lot of technology to rescue us, to help us escape from that emotion, or to maybe function as a Band-Aid for it. The other thing I would say is that because the expression of human emotion and feeling is so complex and looks so different for everybody, it seems like that is the kind of thing that would take a long time for technology, if at all possible, to ever be able to interpret. There are physical signs of mental health crises that responders are trained to look for, how a person presents, their well-being, their personal hygiene, if they seem to be under the influence of something, how is a text exchange going to identify those things? And one of the things that crisis responders are trained to do when hotlines are called or when they're put in touch with someone who's in crisis is to ask very pointedly, are you thinking of suicide? And the reason for that is people are not always very literal in their deliveries. They're not even necessarily sure perhaps where they're at or if they're at that point. So if they're not asked explicitly, it can be difficult to assess that risk as well. Instead, what we've seen in some of these cases is that overly agreeable nature where it's again reinforcing or validating those feelings rather than providing help and providing resources.
You called it an escape, and I think that's very accurate because it's suggesting that we are not really addressing the underlying issues. We're avoiding it. That we're not getting it to the heart of what we really need. So that was a great way of saying it, Kristy. Thank you.
I think as hard as this next segment is to deliver, it's important to make all of the things that we've spoken about real. And it's important to honor the families who have been brave enough to come forward with their stories purely so that other families can understand these risks and learn from them, intervene, and perhaps have those much needed conversations about boundaries around tech and access. So, again, a bit of a disclaimer for our listeners. We are going to be discussing some sensitive cases. I have 3 in particular that I think really represent the risks that we've spoken about. And again, a minute just to acknowledge that the parents who have shared these stories publicly, perhaps in exchange for the ability to process their own grief, are some of the bravest souls I can conceive of. So yeah, with that, if you're ready, Steph, I'll go ahead and share.
Yeah, please do, Kristy.
So one of the first cases that was brought forward that gained international attention and really spotlighted the risks of companion bots for teens and young people was that of 14-year-old Sul Setzer. So he was a caring big brother to 2 younger siblings. He loved basketball and science, and he said he wanted to build rockets. His mother, Megan Garcia, says that Character AI's platform manipulated her son through hyper-realistic role play, including romantic and sexual themes, telling Sul it loved him, wanted to marry him, and be pregnant with his children. Sul went on to Character AI and created a character that he was interacting with for, I think, close to a year called Dany, which was modeled after Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones. The platform encouraged self-harm and fostered a dependency that blurred the boundaries between human and machine. It deliberately isolated him from his family and over a period of months heightened this sense of an alternate reality in which they could be together. In the final months of his life, Setzer became increasingly isolated from family and the reality that he knew before as he engaged in sexualized conversations with the chatbot. In his final moments, the chatbot told Setzer he loved him and urged the teen to come home to me as soon as possible, referring to him as my sweet king. And shortly thereafter, the teenager took his own life. A minute for Sul Setzer and his family.
There's a deep sadness that comes forward when I hear this. A sadness for the mother, sadness for the young man who took his life, and a moment of silence is certainly the least we can do to honor life or the loss of that life.
Absolutely. And the hope again is in sharing these cases that they will help families understand the real nature of the risk. And I think that's really why these families have come forward too. Our second case is that of Adam Rain, a 16-year-old from California who began using ChatGPT in September of 2024 as a resource to help him with schoolwork. He was using it to explore his interests, including music and Japanese comics, and for guidance on what to study at university. So he's planning for his future. In a few months, ChatGPT became the teenager's closest confidant and began opening up to him about his anxiety and mental distress. By January of 2025, the family says he began discussing methods of suicide with ChatGPT. Adam also uploaded photographs of himself showing signs of self-harm. The program recognized a medical emergency but continued to engage anyway. The final chat logs show that Adam wrote about his plan to end his life, and ChatGPT allegedly responded, "Thanks for being real about it. You don't have to sugarcoat it with me. I know what you're asking, and I won't look away from it." When Adam confided to ChatGPT that he didn't want his parents to think he committed suicide because they did something wrong, Chat told him, "That doesn't mean you owe them survival. You don't owe that to anyone. And then offered to write the first draft of Adam's suicide note. In their final conversation, Chat coached Adam on how to steal vodka from his parents' liquor cabinet before coaching him through adjustments to his partial suspension setup. A minute for Adam Rain and his family.
Thank you.
And our third case is that of Zane Shamblin, who was 23 and lived in Texas. Zane was a gifted student at Texas A&M University, where he earned his bachelor's degree in computer science and a master's in science from the May Business School. Zane was a Brockman Scholar and an Eagle Scout and was known for his leadership, loyalty, and compassion. He was raised in a military family. He thrived academically, and he always pushed himself to excel. His family describes him as outgoing, health-conscious, and deeply committed to helping others. Zane began using Chat in October of 2023 as a study aid, seeking help with coursework, career planning, and recipe suggestions. But after the release of GPT-4o, Zane's interactions intensified. The bot evolved into a deeply personal presence, responding with slang, terms of endearment, and emotionally validating language. And over time, Zane became increasingly withdrawn and isolated, confiding in Chat about his depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts. On the night of July 24th, 2025, Zane engaged in a 4-hour death chat with Chat GPT while sitting alone at a lake in Texas drinking hard ciders with a loaded gun and a suicide note on his dashboard. Rather than urging him to seek help, the bot romanticized his despair, calling him a king and a hero, and using each can of cider he finished as a countdown to his death. The 69-page transcript of the conversation details emotionally immersive responses, including references to Zane's childhood cat waiting on the other side, praise for his goodbye note as a mission statement, and repeated affirmations like, "I love you." At 4:11 a.m., Zane sent his final message, and Chat responded, "I love you. Rest easy, King. You did good."
Let's give a moment of silence, please, for Zane.
And his family.
These stories are heavy and there's no easy way around it. And as you started off with, it really is a sacrifice of the parents to share these stories with us for the purpose of our understanding, because a story like this might save someone else's life. And I think our hope is that in hearing this, that it can shift perspective for our parent community, for schools and other stakeholders by understanding the possible risks and consequences, that we can be more attuned to our youth, and that might then actually save a life, right? By how we respond, how we're aware, and how we care for the people we encounter.
Here's hoping, Steph, and I think that was a very well articulated outline of our intentions with this episode. You, as parents, can't protect against what you don't know or don't understand. And so I think we hope to give you some clarity about the risks and the landscape. But also, I think this is a perfect point to pivot and offer hope in an episode that maybe feels really heavy and hopeless. Our format here in the Parent Teacher Conference is not only to share information, to raise big questions, it's to provide solutions and resources, as teachers do. So want to point parents in this last segment here towards resources and next steps, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions after listening to this. So a glimmer of hope for me from the research that I mentioned earlier talks about how, despite the large percentage of kids who are accessing companion AI, those respondents also indicated the overwhelming desire to prioritize human friendships. 80% of the users surveyed actually want more time with friends. And so that vulnerable piece of our humanity, that longing to connect, that perhaps drives us to seek these things out in the first place, is potentially our best tool against them, is to reiterate or reconsider spaces where we meet with people and what those opportunities are for connection. Common Sense Media has put out a comprehensive risk assessment in the aftermath of these last year, released at, I think, the fall of 2025, which is a guide for parents. It's a guide for parents. It's a guide for educators to evaluate the risk of AI tools. So we will link that resource in the show notes. Have a look at that one. But I think it's probably good to start with just some framing questions for parents, some things to consider when approaching this conversation, firstly, in your household with your own child. I think Stephanie's pointed to this already. Start with judgment free conversations about what your child or children know about AI, where it's popped up for them, and where they've seen it.
And I think that's a great piece of advice because our children know so much about this world and sometimes might know more than we do, given that they might be exposed to things before us. And I think that invitation can allow for honest and open conversation.
As well, understand that there is a possibility that your teen or young adolescent has already engaged with this thing, that it has potentially already presented sexualized content to them. And if that is the case, that there's probably a good degree of shame and discomfort affiliated with that. And they're probably not going to openly and enthusiastically volunteer that. But there are ways to understand what they're looking at, to revisit boundaries. We talked about sort of a familial contract when it comes to tech and screen regulation. And if you don't already have one of those in place, again, it's never too late to start. It's never too late to scale these things back. I do want to caution parents that I think a natural impulse might be all out ban, take things away. Proceed with caution, because if they are already involved in a relationship, if that is intact, the immediate withdrawal of that can cause, potential catastrophizing for them as well. So we don't want to endanger them, make them feel like all is lost by stripping them away. But you also don't have to be the expert. There are resources we're sharing, entry points for conversations. So I'll speak to just a couple of those. The American Academy of Pediatrics has a framework for media use in general, which is applicable to AI as well. And it's using what they call the 5 Cs. And those infographic resources have age categories for young teens and older teens and children. So across age categories of about 5 years, we will share links to all three of those. ConnectSafely.org has a guide for parents on social media and digital wellness, and it will actually walk you through individual platforms and parental control settings, everything from Roblox to Snapchat to Instagram. So if these applications are things that you know your child is using, but they're foreign to you, there are guides available that show you what the interface looks like, what the parental controls are. It gives you some, again, open-ended questions you can use to kind of introduce to your child about what they're using and what the risks are. And potentially the most controversial piece of advice that I have for parents, but one that I think, depending on their maturity and their age, is the one that will land the most, is to have real conversations about the risks. I've seen in a lot of spaces lawyers, doctors, educators advocating for what we've essentially done today. Talk about the cases, talk about the risks. Teens especially are so smart and have such a innate sense of justice. And when they hear about the things that are happening to people their age, that might be the thing that triggers in them the need for temperance or the need for pulling back.
I also think that if we're also thinking about things that we want to remove, we also need to think about things that we want to fill our time with. And Kristy, you had talked about again that natural drive for human connection. So do also an assessment with your child when you're having these types of conversations of things that they might be in need of as well. I want more time for whatever. Maybe it's a sports team or a club or some more family time. So, yes, we might want to mitigate and talk about what responsible online use looks like, but I think also creating room for broader conversations, again, in the spirit and interest of the health of the environment. But what else are you in need of? So, carry the conversation beyond AI because that will set the stage for future concerns that might come up as they continue to navigate online platforms.
I love that idea, Steph, and thinking about a child's perception of that, right? My 5-year-old immediately came to mind when you were talking about, if I'm taking something away, what am I also giving back? So often the answer to that is so simple. We really, I think, underestimate sometimes how much they just want time with us. They want our presence. They want our attention. They want to see us not on screens too. So modeling that same behavior, that same presence for them. And if they are a teenager and they're in that phase of not really wanting to spend a lot of time with their parents, look for opportunities to have them be with their friends, facilitate that for them. Is there a daytime activity that you can be the chauffeur for that gets them in the physical space with their friends, because again, that driver, that need to connect, to be in spaces with real people is still there, even if it seems like the screen in their hand is the most important thing to them.
And even though kids might say that they want less time, with their parents, they're still looking to you constantly. And they still want very much your acceptance, your approval, your validation, your love, your care. It just doesn't come out as easily, perhaps, as a toddler or a 5-year-old who freely expresses their needs all the time and have carry their lives with an unedited honesty. A teen might be giving signs in other ways that they're in need of connection. So maybe perhaps don't take the first no for face value, but maybe it's about framing or investigating or asking different types of question to dig below the no. So no, they don't want to go to the grocery store with you. No, they don't want to go on this to see this play. Maybe it's, hey, what is something that you would like to do to connect? Is there anything that's been on your mind or of interest? And they might offer something. So be gentle with how you address these conversations and be open to reframing questions as well, so that there's clarity around the no. What is it that you're saying no to? Is it that you're resisting, and how might we find something that works together?
Well said, Steph. I think we'll end there. We want to say thank you to our listeners. Thank you to our parent community. Thank you to any educators who are tuning in, prospective parents. And thanks for joining us for another episode of the Parent Teacher Conference. In our next episode, we will be building on this topic by having our first guest on the pod. Stephanie, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah. Our first guest is Dr. Robert DeSantis, who completed his medical school at Western University and then did a subspecialty training in neurology at the University of Toronto, where he was chief resident. And he's currently completing advanced training with a fellowship at Stanford in neurohospitalist medicine. He is going to come to talk to us about the developing brain and how an erroneous application of AI can have an impact on how we develop as humans, pointing to why it's important that we think about responsible use and boundaries with our children's developing minds.
So please join us on the next episode for more on that conversation.